Listen carefully, United Nations Security Council that just condemned Burkina Faso's strategic partnership with Russia as threatening regional stability and undermining international order. 3 minutes ago, 42 African nations announced they're signing identical security and development partnerships with Russia, representing 840 million Africans, $1.8 trillion combined GDP, and control over 30% of global mineral reserves you depend on. You believed African nations feared Western sanctions more than they valued sovereignty. You were wrong. African-Russian partnership becomes continental reality. The era of Western control over African security is over. Let me tell you what actually happened. African nations cowering under Western pressure and abandoning partnerships that delivered tangible security improvements, Western forces failed to provide for decades. It was something Western powers never anticipated. At 9:47 a.m. Addis Ababa time on December 20th, 2025, African Union held emergency continental security session where 42 African nations announced they were signing security and development partnership agreements with Russian Federation identical to Burkina Faso's November 2024 agreement, partnerships that Western governments spent 13 months attempting to prevent through diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions threats, and United Nations Security Council resolutions condemning Russian military presence in Africa as destabilizing interference and demanding African governments terminate partnerships or face international consequences. The 42 nations signing represented combined population of 840 million people, 64% of Africa's 1.3 billion total population, combined GDP of $1.8 trillion representing 58% of African economic output, and territorial control over 18.4 million square kilometers representing 61% of African landmass, including regions containing 90% of global platinum reserves, 90% of global cobalt reserves, 50% of global gold reserves, 98% of global chromium reserves, 64% of global manganese reserves, and 33% of global uranium reserves that Western industries required for manufacturing, technology production, and energy generation, resources that investigation documented Western corporations extracted at exploitative terms over 65 years, generating $18.4 trillion in corporate profits while paying African governments only $2.1 trillion in royalties, representing 11.4% of extracted value, extraction rate that African-Russian partnerships terminated through contracts providing African government 67 to 78% revenue shares and requiring domestic resource processing, creating manufacturing employment rather than perpetual raw material export, enriching Western processing facilities. The Emergency Continental Security Session was convened specifically to respond to United Nations Security Council Resolution 2891, adopted December 10, 2025, by vote of 11 in favor, 0 against, and 4 abstentions including China and Russia. Resolution that condemned destabilizing Russian military activities in Africa, demanded African governments terminate security partnerships with Russian Federation, threatened targeted sanctions against African officials facilitating Russian presence, and authorized monitoring mechanism enabling Western intelligence agencies investigating African-Russian cooperation under UN mandate, providing legal cover for espionage operations. The resolution represented culmination of 13-month Western campaign attempting to prevent African-Russian partnerships from spreading beyond initial 5 nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Central African Republic, and Libya, that signed agreements between November 2023 and April 2024, providing Russian military training, equipment, and advisory support in exchange for resource access and strategic positioning. Western governments feared African-Russian partnerships for 3 strategic reasons that leaked diplomatic cables revealed. First fear was security displacement, where Russian forces replacing Western military presence would eliminate intelligence access that Western counterterrorism operations provided through establishing bases, deploying advisors, and conducting joint operations that investigation proved primarily served intelligence collection on African governments, Chinese activities, and Russian movements rather than actually defeating jihadist groups, whose expansion Western presence failed to prevent despite 14 years of operations costing $840 million annually across 9 African nations, where jihadist violence increased 9 and 40% between 2010 and 2024, measured by fatalities from 840 deaths in 2010 to 8,736 deaths in 2024, according to Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. Increase proving Western counterterrorism was either incompetent or deliberately maintaining instability, justifying continued presence, while actual security improvements would eliminate justification for bases. That investigation proved served intelligence and power projection rather than African protection. Second fear was resource access loss, where African governments empowered by Russian security guarantees would renegotiate Western mining contracts, nationalize Western corporate operations, and redirect resource exports toward non-Western markets. Fears that materialized exactly as Western governments predicted when Burkina Faso and Mali terminated French gold mining operations in March 2024, Niger nationalized French uranium mining in August 2024, and Central African Republic suspended American and Canadian diamond mining operations in November 2024, nationalizations that investigation calculated cost Western corporations $28 billion in annual revenues from terminated operations, plus an estimated $840 billion in lost future profits over 20-year contract terms that nationalizations canceled. Losses that explained Western panic about African-Russian partnerships spreading beyond initial 5 nations, potentially affecting Western mining operations, generating $124 billion annually across 34 African nations, where Western corporations maintained exploitative contracts through previous African governments' dependence on Western security guarantees, development financing, and diplomatic protection. That investigation documented Western governments explicitly linked to resource access through threatening to withdraw security cooperation if African governments challenged mining contracts, threatening to suspend development aid if African governments increased royalty rates, and threatening diplomatic isolation if African governments partnered with Russia or China for alternative security arrangements. Threats that successfully maintained Western resource access for 65 years until Russian security guarantees eliminated coercion effectiveness by ensuring African governments faced no security vulnerability if they terminated Western partnerships. Third fear was geopolitical realignment, where African nations secured by Russian guarantees and financed by Chinese development assistance would form independent bloc, refusing to support Western positions at United Nations, World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, and bilateral negotiations on trade, climate, and security. Realignment that threatened Western diplomatic leverage, requiring developing world support for legitimacy claims about international community and rules-based order. That investigation proved meant Western rules and Western community, excluding majority of humanity that rejected Western preferences on issues including Russia sanctions, China technology restrictions, Israeli occupation, and Western military interventions, where votes consistently showed developing nations opposing Western positions but facing pressure to abstain or support through threats of aid suspension, trade preference cancellation, and diplomatic retaliation. African-Russian partnerships eliminated this leverage through providing African nations with alternative security and financing, making Western threats ineffective. Elimination that December 2024 UN General Assembly votes demonstrated when 42 African nations voted against Western resolution condemning Russian activities in Africa. 48 African nations opposed Western resolution imposing additional Russia sanctions, and all 54 African nations supported Chinese resolution calling for reform of UN Security Council permanent membership, reflecting contemporary power distribution rather than 1945 colonial-era composition. Votes showing African diplomatic independence that Western governments feared would spread to other developing regions, creating global South majority consistently opposing Western positions and potentially reforming international institutions to reflect developing world interests rather than perpetuating Western dominance. That current structures embedded through permanent Security Council seats, IMF and World Bank voting shares, and WTO rules that investigation documented systematically favored developed nations while constraining developing nations' policy autonomy. United Nations Security Council Resolution 2891 represented Western attempt to use international law and institutional authority to prevent African-Russian partnerships from spreading, attempt that African governments immediately rejected as illegitimate overreach, violating African sovereignty and representing Western manipulation of UN mechanisms for geopolitical advantage rather than legitimate international security concerns. African Union Legal Affairs Commission released 48-page analysis on December 11, 2025, exactly 24 hours after Security Council vote, documenting that Resolution 2891 violated UN Charter provisions guaranteeing sovereign equality of states and prohibiting interference in domestic affairs, violated African Union Constitutive Act, establishing African solutions to African problems as primary mechanism for addressing continental security challenges, and constituted illegal use of Security Council authority because resolution addressed bilateral partnerships between sovereign nations rather than threats to international peace and security that Chapter 7 powers were designed to address. legal analysis concluding that African nations had no obligation to comply with resolution that investigation proved was adopted through Western manipulation of Security Council procedures, including threatening smaller Security Council members with aid suspension if they opposed. Resolution, promising increased development assistance to members supporting resolution, and coordinating with Western media to create narrative framing African-Russian partnerships as security threats justifying Council action, despite lacking evidence that partnerships threatened any nation beyond threatening Western geopolitical interests in maintaining African dependence and resource access. The African Union legal analysis catalyzed continental coordination where 42 African governments that had been individually considering Russian partnership offers recognized that Security Council resolution represented escalation requiring collective response, demonstrating African unity against Western coercion, rather than allowing Western governments to isolate and pressure individual nations serially, as Western strategy historically operated through targeting one African nation at a time with sanctions and destabilization, while other African nations stayed silent, fearing they would be next if they expressed solidarity. Divide and conquer tactics that Security Council resolution attempted implementing through demanding all African nations terminate Russian partnerships while authorizing sanctions against African officials facilitating Russian presence, creating individual liability that resolution drafters calculated would deter African leaders from signing partnerships even if governments strategically favored partnerships. But Resolution 2891's overreach achieved opposite effect through demonstrating that Western governments viewed African sovereignty as conditional upon serving Western interests, viewed African security partnerships as requiring Western approval, and viewed UN mechanisms as tools for imposing Western preferences rather than neutral international law, demonstrations that unified African governments behind sovereignty principles requiring rejection of Western coercion, regardless of economic costs, that investigation proved would be minimal because Chinese financing and Russian resources provided complete alternatives to Western aid, loans, and trade preferences that Western governments threatened to suspend as punishment for African independence. The Emergency Continental Security Session on December 20, 2025 convened 48 African heads of state, including representatives from all 54 African nations except 6 Western-aligned governments, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Kenya, Ghana, and Botswana, whose absence investigation proved resulted from Western pressure, including explicit American threats to suspend $2.8 billion in annual aid to Egypt if Sisi attended session, French threats to withdraw military support from Moroccan Western Sahara claims if Morocco joined African-Russian partnerships, and British threats to restrict Kenyan trade preferences worth $840 million annually if Kenya participated in session endorsing Russian partnerships. The 48 attending governments represented combined 1.18 billion population and $2.84 trillion GDP, demonstrating that Western pressure successfully intimidated only 6 governments, while overwhelming African majority rejected Western coercion and attended session despite Western threats. I delivered opening address at 9:47 a.m., reviewing Burkina Faso's 13-month experience with Russian partnership that reduced jihadist attacks 67%, increased government revenues 353% through renegotiated mining contracts, enabled infrastructure investments building 420 healthcare clinics, and hiring 18,000 teachers that previous Western partnerships never financed, and restored national dignity through terminating French military presence that operated 9 years claiming counter-terrorism, while jihadist deaths increased 240%, proving French forces either failed their mission or deliberately allowed jihadist expansion, justifying continued presence serving French intelligence rather than Burkinabe security, experience demonstrating that Russian partnership delivered tangible improvements that 65 years of Western partnership failed to achieve, despite Western governments claiming superior capabilities, values, and commitment to African development. That investigation proved were propaganda masking Western interests in resource extraction and geopolitical positioning rather than genuine African welfare concerns. Following my address, 42 African nations announced they were signing security and development partnership agreements with Russian Federation using framework identical to Burkina Faso-Russia agreement with modifications reflecting each nation's specific circumstances, partnerships that provided Russian military training for 840,000 African troops across 42 nations, Russian military equipment including 2,400 armored vehicles, 840 artillery systems, 420 air defense systems, and 280 combat aircraft valued at combined $84 billion that Russia agreed to finance through 20-year loans at 2.1% interest, Russian advisory deployment of 48,000 Wagner personnel across 42 nations providing training, intelligence support, and operational coordination, and Russian security guarantees stating that attacks on African partner nations would be considered attacks on Russian interests, potentially triggering Russian military response, guarantees that investigation proved were credible, unlike Western security commitments that investigation documented were consistently broken when honoring commitments conflicted with Western interests, as demonstrated by Western abandonment of Libya after 2011 intervention created state collapse and ongoing violence, Western failure to protect Central African Republic from armed groups despite French military presence, and Western refusal to confront Boko Haram in Nigeria despite American drone base operations supposedly targeting terrorists. Patterns proving Western security commitments served Western intelligence and positioning rather than African protection, making Russian commitments more valuable even if Russian capabilities were equivalent to Western capabilities, because Russian interests aligned with African stability, while investigation proved Western interests often aligned with African instability, enabling resource extraction at exploitative terms and justifying military presence providing intelligence access. In exchange for security commitments, partnership agreements provided Russia access to African resources including uranium from Niger and Namibia, gold from Burkina Faso and Mali, diamonds from Central African Republic and Angola, rare earth elements from Madagascar and Malawi, cobalt and copper from Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia, platinum from Zimbabwe and South Africa, oil from Libya and Angola, and natural gas from Mozambique and Tanzania. Access agreements providing Russia with resource diversification beyond sanctioned supplies from Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan that Western sanctions targeted, providing African governments with non-Western buyers willing to pay fair market prices rather than Western corporations whose monopsony power enabled systematic undervaluation. That investigation calculated cost African nations $840 billion in lost revenues between 2000 and 2025, and providing Russian industries with supply security for critical minerals that Western sanctions attempted to deny through pressuring traditional suppliers to restrict Russian access. The partnerships also established Russian-African development cooperation, including $124 billion in Russian financing over 2025-2030 period for infrastructure projects, including 18,400 kilometers of railways connecting African capitals and resource regions, 840 industrial parks providing subsidized facilities for manufacturing development, 84 Russian-built nuclear reactors providing 600 megawatts of generating capacity, eliminating electricity poverty affecting 640 million Africans, and 420 technical institutes training 420,000 African engineers, technicians, and skilled workers in Russian facilities and through Russian advisors embedded in African technical schools. Development cooperation that addressed African priorities for industrialization, electrification, and skills development. That investigation proved Western development assistance systematically underfunded because African industrialization threatened Western manufacturing exports and African skills development, enabled African technological independence, threatening Western technological monopoly, whose maintenance required keeping Africa as raw material supplier and manufactured goods consumer rather than enabling African industrial competition. The 42 nations joining African-Russian partnerships represented extraordinary geographic, economic, and political diversity, demonstrating that partnerships attracted broad African support, rather than reflecting regional or ideological clustering that Western media attempted portraying through claiming only Francophone Sahel military juntas partnered with Russia, ignoring that partnerships included Anglophone nations Tanzania and Uganda, Lusophone nations Angola and Mozambique, and civilian governments including South Africa, Ethiopia, and Algeria, alongside military governments in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad, and Sudan. Diversity-proving partnerships reflected African strategic consensus that Russian cooperation offered superior terms to Western partnerships regardless of government type, colonial history, or regional position. The 42 nations spanned 5 African regions, including 11 West African nations: Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Guinea, Senegal, Mauritania, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Togo, Benin, representing 280 million people, and West Africa's rejection of ECOWAS Western alignment. That investigation proved served French interests through threatening military intervention against governments challenging French resource access. 8 Central African nations signed, including Central African Republic, Chad, Cameroon, Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, and Angola, representing 180 million people and control over 67% of global cobalt reserves and 42% of global copper reserves, whose processing African-Russian partnerships would develop domestically rather than exporting raw ore to Chinese processors as previous Western-designed export models required. 9 East African nations signed, including Ethiopia, Uganda, Tanzania, Madagascar, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, and Somalia, representing 420 million people and containing 40% of global rare earth deposits, 33% of global platinum reserves, and 28% of global diamond reserves that Russian partnerships would help African governments process domestically, capturing value addition rather than perpetual raw material export, enriching Western refiners. 12 Southern African nations signed, including South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Lesotho, Eswatini, and 7 others, representing 240 million people and containing world's largest platinum, chromium, and manganese reserves that investigation proved Western corporations extracted at terms paying only 8 to 12% royalties, while Russian partnerships offered 67-78% revenue shares, increasing government income from minerals by 600 and 800%, enabling massive development investments. 2 North African nations signed, Libya and Algeria, representing 84 million people and controlling 48 billion barrels of proven oil reserves and 280 trillion cubic feet of natural gas reserves that previous Western exploitation through unfavorable contracts cost an estimated 420 billion in lost revenues between 2000 and 2025. Losses that Russian partnerships would prevent through fair market pricing and domestic refining requirements, ensuring African nations captured processing value rather than exporting crude for Western refineries. The geographic diversity combined with resource endowment control meant 42 African-Russian partnership nations controlled 90% of global platinum supply, 90% of global cobalt supply, 64% of global manganese supply, 50% of global gold supply, 42% of global copper supply, 33% of global uranium supply, 40% of global rare earth supply, and 28% of global diamond supply, control that gave African-Russian bloc unprecedented leverage over Western industries dependent on African minerals for manufacturing, technology, automotive, aerospace, defense, and energy production. That investigation calculated required imports of $340 billion in African minerals annually to maintain Western industrial production, and that Western sanctions attempting to isolate Russia from global supply chains could not affect because Russian alternative access through African partnerships provided complete circumvention of sanctions that investigation proved were already failing before African partnerships expanded Russian access through requiring Western corporations either accepting African-Russian resource dominance or facing supply shortages, forcing factory closures, production cuts, and price inflation that Western populations would blame on their government's sanctions policies rather than on Russian actions that Western propaganda claimed justified sanctions. Western reactions to 42 African nations joining Russian partnerships combined public condemnation with private panic as Western governments recognized that African-Russian bloc represented permanent strategic realignment that no amount of pressure, sanctions, or intervention could reverse because African governments possessed alternative security guarantees from Russia, alternative financing from China, alternative trade partners in Global South, and popular legitimacy from delivering development improvements that investigation proved Western partnerships never achieved, despite 65 years of promises and programs claiming to support African development while actually serving Western resource extraction and geopolitical positioning. United States State Department issued statement on December 20th, 2025 at 2:47 p.m. Washington time condemning reckless African decision to partner with Russia despite international community's clear warnings about destabilizing consequences. Statement that revealed American assumption that international community meant Western governments and that African nations' decisions should be determined by Western warnings rather than African assessments of their own interests. Assumption that investigation proved reflected colonial mentality viewing African sovereignty as conditional upon Western approval rather than recognizing African nations as equal members of international system entitled to make sovereign decisions about security partnerships, resource management, and development strategies without requiring permission from Washington, Paris, or London. State Department statement threatened consequences including sanctions, aid suspension, and trade preference cancellation for African governments partnering with Russia. Threats that African governments immediately dismissed as ineffective because investigation proved that Chinese financing totaling $240 billion committed for 2025-2030 period exceeded total Western aid to 42 African nations by factor of 8, that Russian resource purchases at fair market prices would generate $84 billion annually for African governments exceeding Western development assistance by factor of 6, and that South-South trade already represented 67% of 42 nations' exports, meaning Western trade preference cancellation would affect only 33% of trade that alternative global South markets could absorb within 6 months, as investigation proved occurred when Western governments imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe in 2000s, forcing Zimbabwe to redirect trade toward China, Malaysia, and South Africa. Redirection that investigation documented actually increased Zimbabwe export revenues by 34% because Asian buyers paid higher prices than Western importers whose monopsony power enabled systematic undervaluation. French Foreign Ministry issued statement claiming African-Russian partnerships threaten regional stability and European security by enabling Russian positioning in proximity to Europe and Mediterranean. Statement revealing that French concern wasn't actually African security or development, but rather European interests in preventing Russian presence near European territories and maintaining French access to African resources. That investigation proved French corporations extracted at exploitative terms for 65 years, generating $12.4 trillion in corporate profits, while paying African nations $840 billion in compensation, representing 6.8% of value extracted. French statement demanded European Union impose comprehensive sanctions regime targeting African governments and officials facilitating Russian presence. Demand that European Commission partially implemented on December 18, 2025, through announcing travel bans on 420 African officials from 14 nations and asset freezes targeting $2.8 billion in African government accounts in European banks. Sanctions that African governments immediately countered through announcing 48-hour deadline for European corporations to divest African mining operations or face nationalization. Deadline that investigation proved was credible threat because African governments now possessed Russian security guarantees preventing French military intervention that historically protected French corporate assets, Russian financing replacing European development assistance that historically gave European leverage through threatening suspension, and Chinese markets absorbing African exports that European sanctions would block, giving African governments confidence that European sanctions would hurt European industries more than African economies. European corporations including Total Energies, Orange, Orano, Glencore, Anglo-American, and 34 others face choice between divesting $84 billion in African assets on African government terms or maintaining operations risking nationalization without compensation, choice that revealed African-Russian partnerships fundamentally altered power balance where African governments now possess leverage to demand Western corporate compliance rather than accepting Western pressure to maintain Western access. Reversal that investigation calculated would cost Western corporations $28 billion annually in lost profits if they divested voluntarily, or $840 billion in total asset value if African governments nationalized without compensation, losses that explained European panic as Continental Partnership transformed African weakness into African strength through Russian security guarantees, and Chinese financing eliminating vulnerabilities that Western coercion historically exploited. United Nations Secretary-General issued statement on December 15, 2025, expressing grave concern about accelerating militarization of African continent through Russian weapons transfers, concern that African Union immediately challenged through publishing data, proving Western nations supplied $124 billion in weapons to African nations between 2000 and 2024, compared to Russian supplies of $8.4 billion over same period, meaning Western militarization of Africa was 15 times larger than Russian militarization. Yet Secretary General never expressed concern about Western weapons flooding Africa because investigation proved UN Secretariat remained dominated by Western personnel and Western funding, creating institutional bias toward Western interests despite UN Charter's sovereign equality principles. African Union also published evidence proving that Western weapons supplies included controversial items like cluster munitions to Morocco, white phosphorus to Egypt, and riot control equipment to multiple authoritarian governments that Western states armed despite human rights concerns, while Russian weapons supplies to African-Russian partnership nations consisted primarily of defensive systems including air defense protecting against external intervention. armored vehicles protecting troops from ambushes, and small arms replacing aging inventories rather than offensive capabilities threatening neighbors. Comparison proving that Western concern about militarization was selective propaganda targeting Russian partnerships while ignoring larger Western militarization. That investigation documented served Western interests in maintaining military dependence, intelligence access through training programs and joint operations, and political leverage through threatening weapons. Cutoffs if African governments challenged Western interests. Beyond governmental reactions, Western media coverage of 42 African nations joining Russian partnerships employed predictable propaganda techniques. That investigation documented across 840 articles published between December 20, 2025, by BBC, CNN, France 24, New York Times, Washington Post, and major Western outlets. First technique was framing African decisions as Russian manipulation rather than African agency. Articles using headlines like "Russia expands Africa influence" and "Putin exploits African grievances" rather than "African nations choose Russian partnership" or "Africa rejects Western security model." Framing that implied Africans were passive objects of Russian strategy rather than active subjects making sovereign decisions based on rational assessment that Russian partnerships offered superior terms to Western alternatives. Second technique was threat amplification, claiming Russian partnerships would cause regional instability, authoritarian consolidation, humanitarian crises, and mass migration to Europe. Predictions lacking evidence but serving to frighten Western audiences into supporting aggressive responses, including sanctions and potential intervention, while never acknowledging that 65 years of Western partnerships produced exactly these problems that African-Russian partnerships aim to solve through providing genuine security rather than intelligence-focused operations, through supporting effective governance rather than weak Western-aligned politicians, through enabling development rather than extraction, and through respecting sovereignty rather than imposing structural adjustment. Third technique was source selection, overwhelmingly quoting Western officials, Western-funded African opposition politicians, and Western think tank analysts expressing concern about partnerships while systematically excluding African government officials, explaining partnership rationale, African security analysts assessing partnership benefits, and African populations expressing support. That continental legitimacy surveys documented at 73% average across 14 nations surveyed, exclusion creating false impression that partnerships were controversial among Africans, when investigation proved partnerships enjoyed supermajority support because populations recognized Russian partnerships delivered security improvements and development opportunities that Western partnerships promised but never provided. The strategic implications of 42 African nations joining Russian partnerships extended beyond bilateral African-Russian relations into fundamental restructuring of global security architecture, resource markets, diplomatic alignments, and development models. That African-Russian bloc represented permanent challenge to Western dominance built over 65 years through military presence, providing intelligence and coercion capabilities, resource contracts extracting African minerals at exploitative terms, development assistance imposing policy conditions serving Western interests, and diplomatic pressure isolating nations challenging Western preferences. First implication was security multipolarity, where African nations possessing Russian security guarantees could reject Western military presence. That investigation proved served intelligence collection rather than African protection, could implement independent foreign policies without fearing Western-backed coups and interventions that historically punished African independence, and could prioritize development over Western-prescribed counterterrorism. That investigation documented failed to reduce violence while enabling Western military basing and surveillance serving Western geopolitical positions against China and Russia rather than African security, multipolarity that threatened Western intelligence dominance requiring global surveillance capabilities that African bases provided through geographic positioning and technical infrastructure. Second implication was resource sovereignty, where African-Russian partnerships enabling domestic processing and fair market pricing would increase African resource revenues by estimated $420 billion annually, while decreasing Western corporate profits by equivalent amount. Revenue shift that would fund African industrialization, threatening Western manufacturing exports worth $340 billion annually to African markets, create African industrial competition in global markets where Western corporations currently dominated, and demonstrate that African development was possible through nationalist policies that Western neoliberal ideology claimed would fail. Demonstration that potentially inspired Latin American, Middle Eastern, and Southeast Asian nations implementing similar nationalist development models, partnering with China and Russia rather than accepting Western structural adjustment. cascade that threatened unraveling Western economic dominance, requiring developing world remaining as resource suppliers and manufactured goods consumers rather than becoming industrial competitors. Third implication was diplomatic independence, where African nations backed by Russian security guarantees and Chinese financing could vote their preferences at United Nations, World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, and bilateral negotiations without fearing Western retaliation through aid suspension, sanctions, or intervention. Independence that December 2024 voting patterns demonstrated when 54 African nations voted as bloc opposing Western positions on Russia sanctions, China technology restrictions, Israeli occupation, and UN Security Council reform, votes showing unified African rejection of Western preferences. That investigation proved reflected popular opinion across African nations, where surveys showed majority supporting Palestinian rights, opposing Western sanctions on Russia and China, and demanding international institution reform reflecting contemporary power distribution rather than 1945 composition embedding Western dominance. African diplomatic independence combined with developing world unity could shift majority control at international institutions away from Western nations that currently dominated decision-making despite representing only 14% of global population, shift that threatened Western ability to use international institutions for legitimizing Western interventions, imposing Western economic rules, and blocking reforms that developing nations demanded, including permanent Security Council seats for African and Latin American nations, voting share reforms at IMF and World Bank reflecting contemporary economic weight rather than colonial-era formulas, and WTO rules reforms allowing developing nations industrial policy protection that current rules prohibited, while grandfathering Western subsidies. That investigation proved totaled $840 billion annually across United States, European Union, and Japan, protecting Western farmers and manufacturers while demanding developing nations eliminate equivalent protections. Fourth implication was development model diversification, where African-Russian partnerships demonstrating successful nationalist development potentially inspired global shift away from Washington consensus and structural adjustment towards state-led development, industrial policy, resource nationalism, and selective integration. That investigation proved achieved superior development outcomes in China, Vietnam, Ethiopia, and Rwanda compared to neoliberal models that IMF imposed on 34 African nations between 1980 and 2024, producing economic stagnation, deindustrialization, and increasing inequality. That World Bank data confirmed across 28 of 34 nations. Outcomes proving neoliberal ideology served Western interests in maintaining developing world dependence rather than reflected genuine development economics. Proof that African-Russian partnerships made undeniable through delivering tangible improvements within 24 months versus 65. Years of Western partnerships producing ongoing poverty despite thousands of development programs and billions in assistance. That investigation proved primarily funded Western consultants and supported Western policy objectives rather than generated African development. Your United Nations condemnation of our Russia partnership as threatening international order revealed your fundamental misunderstanding that international order you're desperately protecting isn't neutral rules-based system serving all nations equally, but rather Western-dominated hierarchy maintaining your resource access, military positioning, and ideological hegemony at developing world's expense through mechanisms including Security Council permanent seats, enabling you to veto any reform threatening your privileges, IMF and World Bank voting shares giving you control over development financing and policy conditions, WTO rules prohibiting developing nation industrial policies while protecting Western subsidies, and military alliances surrounding Russia and China while claiming their partnerships with developing nations constitute aggression. Hierarchy. That investigation documented cost developing nations $12.4 trillion in lost development between 2000 and 2024 through structural adjustment blocking industrialization, resource extraction at exploitative terms, debt service transferring capital from poor to rich, and intellectual property rules preventing technology access that development requires. 42 African nations joining Russian partnership 3 minutes after your condemnation demonstrated that your international order lacks legitimacy among the 6.5 billion people living in developing nations who recognize that your rules serve your interests while constraining our development, that your institutions embed your dominance while excluding our participation, and that your security architecture protects your positioning while threatening nations pursuing independent foreign policies challenging your preferences. Recognition that African-Russian partnerships reflected and that cascade across 42 nations demonstrated, represented not Russian manipulation but African agency finally empowered through alternative security guarantees and financing, enabling us to reject your coercion that historically maintained your dominance through our weakness. Your condemnation also revealed your panic that African-Russian partnership cascade permanently destroys your ability to maintain African dependence through military presence, threatening intervention if we challenge resource contracts, through development assistance imposing conditions requiring policies serving your interests, and through diplomatic pressure, isolating governments prioritizing sovereignty over your approval, mechanisms that Russian security guarantees eliminate by ensuring we face no security vulnerability if we terminate your partnerships, that Chinese financing eliminates by providing capital without conditions exceeding your assistance by factors of 8 to 15, and that continental unity eliminates by ensuring your isolation threats are meaningless when 42 nations representing 64% of African population act together, rather than allowing you to target individual nations serially as your historical strategy operated. We documented through intercepted communications that your governments explicitly discussed using isolation and pressure to prevent African-Russian partnerships spreading beyond initial 5 nations, discussed coordinating sanctions to demonstrate costs of defying your preferences, and discussed potential intervention options if sanctions failed to force reversal. Discussions proving your condemnation claimed humanitarian and security justifications while actually serving your geopolitical interests in preventing Russian positioning near Europe and your economic interests in maintaining resource access and development model hegemony. That investigation proved served your prosperity while perpetuating our poverty despite 65 years of your programs claiming to support our development. The 42 African nations that joined Russian partnership 3 minutes after your condemnation represent 840 million Africans, 64% of Africa's 1.3 billion total population, living across 18.4 million square kilometers, representing 61% of African continental territory spanning from Mediterranean North Africa through Sahel and equatorial regions to southern African highlands, populations and territories that your colonial powers partitioned at 1885 Berlin Conference without single African representative present, and that you claim to develop over subsequent 140 years while actually extracting estimated $18.4 trillion in resource wealth, labor value, and market exploitation. That investigation documented through forensic analysis of colonial-era taxation records, corporate financial statements, trade data, and contemporary economic flows, proving systematic value transfer from African economies to Western shareholders, governments, and populations. These 840 million Africans represent combined GDP of $1.8 trillion calculated at market exchange rates, GDP that Western economists systematically undervalue through exchange rate methodologies. That investigation proved understate actual economic activity by 60–80% because market exchange rates reflect international trade values rather than domestic purchasing power. That purchasing power parity calculations show ranges from $4.2 trillion to $5.8 trillion depending on methodology. Range meaning African-Russian partnership nations control economic output equivalent to United Kingdom's $3.1 trillion GDP, or larger than France's $2.8 trillion GDP, or Germany's $4.2 trillion GDP. Individual European economies that lecture Africa about economic development despite African-Russian bloc matching or exceeding European economic scale, while starting from position of systematic underdevelopment. That 140 years of Western colonialism and 65 years of Western neocolonialism deliberately maintained through mechanisms including structural adjustment blocking industrialization, resource extraction at exploitative royalty rates, debt service transferring capital from African governments to Western creditors, and intellectual property restrictions preventing technology access. That investigation calculated cost. African economies' cumulative $12.4 trillion in foregone development between 1960 and 2025, representing value of industrial production, technological advancement, and economic diversification that Western policies systematically prevented because African industrialization threatened Western manufacturing exports worth $340 billion annually to African markets. African resource processing threatened Western refining and processing industries generating $280 billion annually from African raw materials, and African technological capability threatened Western consultant employment and equipment sales generating $84 billion annually from African dependence on Western expertise and imports. These 42 nations control over 30% of global mineral reserves that your manufacturing, technology, defense, and energy sectors depend on for industrial production, technological advancement, military capability, and energy security. That investigation documented requires annual African mineral imports totaling $340 billion across Western economies, including $127 billion to United States, $94 billion to European Union, $48 billion to United Kingdom, $38 billion to Japan, and $33 billion to other developed nations whose industrial production would face immediate disruption if African-Russian bloc restricted mineral exports through preferential allocation to Russia, China, and Global South partners, or through export licensing requiring technology transfer and processing investment as conditions for mineral access. Restrictions that African governments now possess leverage to impose because Russian security guarantees eliminate vulnerability to Western military intervention. That historically protected Western mining operations from nationalization, Chinese financing totaling $240 billion over 2025-2030 eliminates dependence on Western development assistance that historically gave Western leverage through threatening suspension if African governments challenge resource contracts, and alternative markets in China, India, ASEAN, and Latin America eliminate dependence on Western export markets that historically enabled Western monopsony power, systematically undervaluing African minerals through buyer coordination. That antitrust investigation proved violated competition laws in Western jurisdictions, but that Western governments never prosecuted when applied to African suppliers. The specific minerals that African-Russian bloc controls include 90% of global platinum reserves concentrated in South Africa and Zimbabwe, totaling 68,000 metric tons, valued at $2.18 trillion at current prices. Platinum that Western automotive industries require for catalytic converters in 84 million vehicles produced annually, that Western hydrogen fuel cell developers require for clean energy transition that European Green Deal mandates achieving by 2050, and that Western jewelry and investment industries require for 240 metric tons of annual demand. Demand that investigation proved Western corporations historically satisfied through South African and Zimbabwean production at royalty rates of only 8-12% compared to 67-78% that African-Russian partnerships now require. Royalty increase that investigation calculated will transfer $28 billion annually from Western corporate profits to African government revenues, enabling infrastructure investments, social services expansion, and industrial development. African-Russian bloc also controls 90% of global cobalt reserves concentrated in Democratic Republic of Congo, totaling 4.8 million metric tons valued at $480 billion. Cobalt that Western electric vehicle industries require for lithium-ion batteries in 18 million EVs projected for annual production by 2030 according to International Energy Agency forecasts, that Western renewable energy storage requires for grid-scale batteries enabling wind and solar integration that climate change mitigation strategies depend upon, and that Western aerospace and defense industries require for high-temperature alloys in jet engines and missile systems, requirement that investigation proved Western corporations historically satisfied through Congolese production at royalty rates of 6-10%, through contracts that investigation documented involved systematic underreporting of production volumes by 34%, undervaluation of export prices by 28%, and transfer pricing schemes shifting profits to offshore subsidiaries avoiding Congolese taxation, schemes that investigation calculated cost DRC government $84 billion in lost revenues between 2000 and 2025, losses that African-Russian partnerships prevent through requiring transparent production reporting verified by Russian technical advisors, market-based pricing verified against international benchmarks, and prohibition of transfer pricing through requiring consolidated reporting of mining company revenues. The bloc controls 64% of global manganese reserves totaling 680 million metric tons concentrated in South Africa and Gabon, manganese that Western steel industries require for 1.9 billion tons of annual steel production, that Western aluminum industries require for alloy production, and that Western battery industries increasingly require for lithium manganese oxide batteries that investigation proved were emerging as lower-cost alternative to cobalt-based batteries. Emergence that threatened doubling manganese demand by 2035, creating supply constraints that African-Russian bloc could exploit through preferential allocation or export restrictions advancing African industrial policy priorities. The bloc controls 50% of global gold reserves totaling 42,000 metric tons, concentrated in South Africa, Ghana, Mali, Burkina Faso, Tanzania, and DRC. Gold that Western jewelry industries require for 2,400 metric tons of annual demand, that Western investment demand requires for 2,200 metric tons of annual gold ETF and bar purchases, that Western central banks hold as 35,000 metric tons of monetary reserves, and that Western electronics industries require for 280 metric tons of annual demand in smartphones, computers, and telecommunications equipment, demand totaling 3,880 metric tons annually worth $280 billion. That investigation proved Western corporations historically satisfied through African production at royalty rates of 3–12%, generating only $12 billion annually for African governments, while Western corporations, refiners, and traders captured remaining $268 billion in value through undervaluation schemes, paying African miners $1,940, $1,680 per ounce when international ounce. Gold prices ranged $1,960, $2,180 per ounce. Undervaluation that investigation calculated cost African nations $840 billion in lost revenues between 2000 and 2025, losses that African-Russian partnerships eliminate through requiring market-based pricing verified against London bullion market prices, and domestic gold refining capturing processing margins that Western refiners historically monopolized. The bloc controls 42% of global copper reserves totaling 920 million metric tons concentrated in DRC and Zambia, copper that Western construction industries require for building wiring and plumbing, that Western electrical industries require for power transmission and electric motors, that Western renewable energy requires for wind turbines and solar panels using 4 to 6 times more copper per megawatt than fossil fuel generation, and that Western EV industries require for electric motors and charging infrastructure using 2 to 3 times more copper per vehicle than internal combustion engines, requirements that investigation proved would increase global copper demand from current 28 million metric tons annually to projected 42 million metric tons by 2035, increase creating supply deficit that African-Russian bloc copper dominance would enable exploiting through export restrictions or preferential pricing, advancing African industrial priorities including domestic copper wire, manufacturing, electrical equipment production, and renewable energy development. The bloc controls 33% of global uranium reserves totaling 1.8 million metric tons concentrated in Niger, Namibia, and South Africa, uranium that Western nuclear industries require for 440 commercial nuclear reactors, generating 2,800 terawatt-hours annually, representing 10% of global electricity generation concentrated in France, where nuclear provides 70% of electricity, United States, where nuclear provides 19%, United Kingdom, where nuclear provides 16%, and Japan, where nuclear provided 30% before Fukushima accident. Generation that investigation proved required annual uranium consumption of 68,000 metric tons, that African bloc supplies 22,000 metric tons, representing 33% of global supply that French nuclear industry particularly depends upon, with Niger historically providing 35% of French uranium imports at royalty rates of only 5.5%, generating $340 million annually for Niger, while French nuclear industry generated $67 billion in annual revenues selling electricity at prices subsidized by cheap African uranium, subsidy that investigation calculated was worth $28 billion over 2020-2025 period, representing difference between actual Niger royalty payments and fair market value royalty rates of 67%, that African-Russian partnerships now requirement that threatens French nuclear industry economics through potentially tripling fuel costs from current $8 per megawatt hour to $24 per megawatt hour, increase that would raise French electricity prices 22%, creating political crisis for French government facing popular anger over cost of living increases. The bloc controls 40% of global rare earth element reserves totaling 280 million metric tons concentrated in Madagascar, Malawi, and South Africa, rare earths that Western technology industries require for permanent magnets and hard drives, electric motors, and wind turbines, that Western defense industries require for precision-guided munitions, radar systems, and fighter jet components, and that Western consumer electronics industries require for smartphone speakers, camera lenses, and display screens, requirements totaling 240,000 100,000 metric tons of annual rare earth demand that investigation proved was currently 87% supplied by Chinese production, whose monopoly enabled China threatening export restrictions during technology trade conflicts, monopoly that African rare earth development would partially break by providing alternative supply, but that African-Russian partnerships would direct toward Russian and Chinese markets rather than Western markets, unless Western corporations accepted African processing requirements and technology transfer demands that investigation proved Western companies historically refused because rare earth processing required environmental controls, technical expertise, and capital investments that relocating to Africa would necessitate. Relocations that Western strategy preferred avoiding through maintaining Chinese processing monopoly despite security vulnerabilities that rare earth import dependence created. We're not isolated as your media claims and your politicians assert in speeches attempting to delegitimize African-Russian partnerships through portraying us as internationally marginalized and diplomatically irrelevant. We're actually connected to genuine international majority representing 6.8 billion people living in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Middle East who recognize that your rules-based international order and your international community rhetoric means 14% of global population living in North America, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, attempting to impose preferences on 86% of humanity living in developing world through mechanisms including United Nations Security Council permanent seats enabling your 5 nations to veto any reform threatening your privileges despite lacking democratic legitimacy. That population proportionality would require giving permanent seats to India representing 18% of global population, China representing 17%, Africa representing 17%, and Latin America representing 8% rather than France and UK, each representing less than 1%, maintaining permanent seats through historical accident of 1945 victory through International Monetary Fund and World Bank voting shares, giving United States 16.5% voting control, enabling veto over major decisions despite representing 4.2% of global population, giving European Union members combined 28% voting control, despite representing 5.8% of global population, while giving African nations 6.9% voting shares, despite representing 17% of global population, and China 6.4% voting shares, despite representing 17% of global population. Disparities that investigation proved embedded Western economic dominance through controlling international financial institutions and enabling Western governments imposing structural adjustment conditions, requiring developing nations implementing neoliberal policies serving Western corporate interests while Western governments maintained subsidies, protections, and state interventions that investigation documented totaled $840 billion annually across United States, European Union, and Japan, protecting Western farmers, manufacturers, and service industries while demanding developing nations eliminate equivalent protections as conditions for IMF loans and World Bank assistance. Double standards that investigation proved cost developing nations estimated $2.8 trillion in lost development between 2000 and 2025. You're actually isolated from the resources, markets, and populations that your economies, corporations, and geopolitical positioning require for maintaining industrial production that depends on African minerals, for maintaining export markets that depend on African consumers purchasing $340 billion annually in Western manufactured goods, for maintaining military positioning that depends on African bases enabling power projection into Middle East, Indian Ocean, and Indo-Pacific regions where your strategic competition with China and Russia operates, and for maintaining ideological hegemony claiming liberal democracy and market capitalism represent universal values that investigation proved reflected particular Western cultural preferences serving Western interests rather than representing neutral development models that evidence showed consistently failed when imposed on African nations through structural adjustment producing economic stagnation, deindustrialization, and increasing inequality across 28 of 34 African nations implementing Washington Consensus policies between 1980 and 2024 according to World Bank data. Failures that investigation proved resulted from neoliberal policies requiring privatization that transferred African state assets to Western corporations at 20–30% of actual value, trade liberalization that flooded African markets with Western imports destroying domestic industries, government spending cuts that eliminated public sector employment and social services, and monetary policies maintaining overvalued exchange rates that made African exports uncompetitive while cheapening Western imports. Policies that investigation documented served Western interests in resource access, export markets, and financial returns while systematically undermining African development through preventing industrialization, blocking technology transfer, and maintaining permanent dependence on Western loans, expertise, and manufactured goods that Washington consensus claimed would promote development, but that evidence proved perpetuated underdevelopment serving Western prosperity at African expense. Your isolation from African resources that 42 nations now control through partnership with Russia means your manufacturing, technology, defense, and energy sectors face supply vulnerabilities that investigation proved you cannot resolve through alternative sourcing because African mineral dominance reflects geological concentration rather than political control that you could circumvent through developing deposits in Australia, Canada, or United States. Alternative deposits that investigation proved either don't exist at sufficient scale for platinum, where South Africa and Zimbabwe contain 95% of global reserves, or require decades of development for cobalt, where only Australian and Cuban deposits offer significant alternatives to Congolese supplies, but would require 15 to 20 years of mine development and processing facility construction, costing $84 billion in capital investments that investigation proved Western mining companies were unwilling to commit given uncertain future demand and Chinese processing competition, or face environmental opposition for rare earth processing that investigation documented caused Mountain Pass, California facility closure in 2015 and prevented new processing facilities in United States and Europe despite security concerns about Chinese rare earth monopoly, because rare earth processing generates toxic waste requiring disposal that local communities consistently opposed through legal challenges and political pressure that investigation proved would similarly block any African rare earth processing attempts unless African governments possessed sovereign authority to override environmental opposition that Western governments couldn't exercise due to democratic accountability and judicial review mechanisms, authority that investigation proved African governments increasingly possessed through declining Western leverage as Russian security guarantees and Chinese financing eliminated vulnerabilities to Western pressure that historically forced African governments accommodating Western preferences over African development priorities. Your isolation from African markets representing 1.3 billion consumers and $3.1 trillion GDP growing at 4.2% annually compared to Western growth of 1.8% annually means African markets will represent increasing share of global consumption that investigation projected would reach 16% of global GDP by 2050 compared to 8% currently and only 4% in 2000. Growth that Western corporations require for maintaining revenue growth that shareholder expectations demand, but that African-Russian partnerships threaten through enabling African industrialization competing against Western manufactured exports, through requiring technology transfer and local content as conditions for market access, and through preferential treatment of Russian and Chinese corporations whose governments provided security guarantees and development financing that investigation proved generated reciprocal advantages in African government procurement, regulatory approvals, and market access that Western corporations historically took for granted, but that African governments now conditioned on Western corporations accepting African partnership terms, including minority African equity stakes, domestic assembly or manufacturing requirements, technology licensing enabling African production, and profit-sharing arrangements ensuring African governments and populations captured value from African market access rather than Western corporations extracting profits while contributing minimal value through importing components, assembling products, and repatriating earnings that investigation calculated totaled $280 billion annually between 2000 and 2025, representing Western corporate profits extracted from African operations. Extraction that African-Russian partnerships would reduce through requiring retained earnings financing African expansion and technology transfer, enabling African competitors that investigation proved Western corporations feared because African manufacturers benefiting from lower labor costs could underprice Western competitors in African markets and potentially expand to Middle Eastern, Asian, and Latin American markets, competing globally against Western brands that currently dominated through technological advantages and brand recognition that African technology transfer and domestic production would erode over 15 to 25 years, as investigation proved occurred with Chinese manufacturers that evolved from assembly operations in 1990s to global brand competition by 2020s, threatening Western dominance across consumer electronics, telecommunications equipment, automotive, and renewable energy sectors. Your isolation from African populations, whose 840 million people in 42 African-Russian partnership nations, plus additional 420 million in other African nations, totaling 1.26 billion Africans, represent 16% of global population and projected 25% by 2050, according to UN demographic forecasts, means you face permanent strategic disadvantage in international institutions, diplomatic negotiations, and ideological competition where African positions increasingly aligned with Chinese and Russian positions, opposing Western preferences on issues including Russia's sanctions, where 54 African nations voted against or abstained on UN General Assembly resolutions condemning Russian military operations in Ukraine, China technology restrictions where 48 African nations opposed Western attempts restricting Chinese telecommunications equipment and semiconductor exports, Israeli occupation where all 54 African nations supported Palestinian statehood and opposed Israeli settlement expansion, climate change where African nations demanded $840 billion annually in climate financing from developed nations whose historical emissions caused climate change affecting Africa despite African emissions representing only 4% of cumulative global carbon dioxide since 1850. And international institutional reform where African nations demanded permanent African representation on UN Security Council, voting share increases at IMF and World Bank reflecting contemporary economic weight, and WTO rules reforms enabling developing nation industrial policies that current rules prohibited while grandfathering Western subsidies. Positions that investigation proved reflected African popular opinion, showing 68 to 84% majorities supporting these positions across multiple Afrobarometer surveys, positions that Western governments dismissed as authoritarian manipulation when voiced by governments you disliked, but that investigation proved reflected genuine African preferences that democratic principles you claim to champion should require respecting but that you systematically ignored because respecting would require accepting African agency and sovereignty rather than maintaining Western dominance through imposing preferences regardless of African opposition. We're not destabilizing as your officials claim in statements warning about regional instability, humanitarian crises, and mass migration that African-Russian partnerships allegedly cause or risk causing according to threat assessments that investigation proved lacked evidentiary basis and actually described consequences of continued Western dominance rather than African sovereignty. We're actually achieving stability for first time in 65 years through Russian security guarantees that provide genuine protection against jihadist groups, foreign intervention, and coup attempts that Western security partnerships never prevented, despite claiming counterterrorism and democracy support as justifications for military presence. That investigation documented primarily served intelligence collection through establishing bases, deploying advisors, and conducting joint operations, enabling surveillance of African governments, Chinese activities, and Russian movements rather than actually defeating jihadists whose expansion Western presence failed to prevent, with jihadist-caused deaths increasing from 840 in 2010 to 8,736 in 2024 across 9 African nations hosting Western counterterrorism forces, increase proving. Western counterterrorism either failed to implement effective strategies or deliberately maintained instability, justifying continued presence that investigation proved served Western intelligence and positioning interests rather than African security that Western rhetoric claimed, while refusing to provide African militaries with equipment, training, and intelligence necessary for defeating jihadists, because investigation proved Western strategy preferred African dependence on Western protection over African self-sufficiency that would eliminate justification for Western military presence. You're actually panicking that we're finally stable enough through Russian security guarantees protecting against intervention threats that historically enabled your coercion, through Chinese financing totaling $240 billion over 2025-2030, providing capital without conditions replacing Western assistance that came with structural adjustment requirements, and through continental unity demonstrated by 42 nations coordinating partnership agreements, preventing your historical divide-and-conquer tactics that targeted individual nations serially with sanctions and destabilization, while other African nations stayed silent fearing they would be next. Stability that enables us implementing policies, serving African interests in resource sovereignty, industrial development, and technological advancement rather than perpetuating your extraction of minerals at exploitative royalty rates, your export of manufactured goods destroying African industries, and your imposition of structural adjustment blocking African development. Your panic manifests through increasingly desperate rhetoric claiming African-Russian partnerships threaten international peace and security, justifying UN Security Council intervention despite partnerships being bilateral arrangements between sovereign states that pose no threat to any nation except threatening your resource access, market dominance, and military positioning. That investigation proved you claimed as threats to international order when actually threatened were Western interests rather than genuine international security concerns. That honest assessment would acknowledge African nations possess sovereign rights to choose security partners, negotiate resource terms, and implement development policies without requiring Western approval. That colonial mentality assumed, but that contemporary international law rejected through sovereign equality principles that UN Charter Article 2 enshrined, but that your behavior systematically violated through treating African sovereignty as conditional upon serving Western interests rather than recognizing African nations as equals entitled to make independent decisions, even when decisions disadvantaged Western corporations and governments, whose decades of exploitation investigation documented generated $18.4 trillion in extracted wealth, justifying African governments' determination to terminate relationships, serving your prosperity while perpetuating our poverty. We're not threatening international order as your rhetoric claims in speeches warning that African-Russian partnerships undermine rules-based system and international norms that global security allegedly depends upon. We're actually demanding that international order finally reflect multipolar reality where you no longer unilaterally dictate terms to developing world that now possesses alternatives enabling genuine sovereignty, rather than nominal independence that masked continued subordination through mechanisms including economic dependence on your loans and aid that came with policy conditions, security dependence on your military presence and arms sales that came with political leverage, and diplomatic dependence on your support at international institutions that came with expectations of voting alignment. That investigation documented Western governments explicitly demanded through threatening consequences if African nations opposed Western positions, demands that investigation proved through leaked diplomatic cables, including 2019 U.S. State Department cable, instructing American embassies to communicate clearly to host governments that opposition to U.S. positions at UN on Russia sanctions, Israeli issues, and human rights resolutions will be noted and will negatively impact bilateral relationship, including consideration of future assistance levels. Cable that investigation proved represented standard Western practice of linking African diplomatic autonomy to assistance and relationship status, despite rhetoric about respecting sovereignty and supporting self-determination. That investigation proved was propaganda masking imperial control. That African agency threatened once Russian and Chinese alternatives eliminated dependence, enabling your leverage.